and welcome to Oxamawian Media Network's English program. I'm your host today, Yersalem, and for those that are observing, we wish you a blessed Easter, Palm Sunday, and Ramadan. Today, we are bringing back special guest, Brother Jeff. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jerusalem. It's good to see you, and it's great to be on the program.
Glad to have you again. And for those unfamiliar, I know you've been a really vocal advocate and people have seen you across multiple platforms, but can you please introduce yourself?
You know, just briefly, it's Brother Jeff. I'm a humanitarian at best and at heart. I do a lot of journalism, multimedia, activism, organizing, etc. And, you know, particularly, you know, from a Pan-Africanist humanitarian aspect. And so that's what brings us all together across boundaries and borders, particularly for those who say that words like, why should I be involved here or there, when in fact, as we deal with humanitarianism, we should be involved everywhere. So that's a little bit about who I am and what I've been up to.
I agree. Activism shouldn't just reside on people that you have a personal impact with, but it should extend to everyone. And I know that your activism has spread beyond Tigray. You explained that you were fighting against apartheid in South Africa and are very involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. So can you explain more about your activism with those particular causes in detail?
Well, I could tell you, being in the U.S. and then also being actively involved in a global movement around apartheid in South Africa, it was eye-opening when I traveled to South Africa and began working there on many different efforts to just see how diverse we are as a people, but then also how the same blueprint has been utilized globally to keep us divided and also keep us fighting one another at our own demise. And actually, most of the conflicts that we see are to our demise and has built Western civilization. So throughout South Africa, I'd been around when Mandela was released from prison. I was in South Africa when Mandela was released from the body. And so I'm very familiar with South Africa. Kenya, the Rift Valley, all the way up to Ethiopia has really been quite interesting to me. And so Black Lives Matter is actually not just a moniker that I believe is central to the United States of America. Again, I think of it from a global perspective, but in the US, I've been very active in organizing, training, and making sure the voices have been heard and raised as it relates to law enforcement and their interaction with Black bodies, particularly murdering them with total disregard.
Thank you for clarifying that. And in addition to your travels to South Africa, I understand that you spent a significant amount of time studying in East Africa, particularly Kenya, Ethiopia, and namely Tigray. Can you describe your experience, what you kind of sought after in your education there, and why particularly sought an education in East Africa?
Well, you know, when we began studying and practicing and organizing in East Africa, it was really connected to the HIV and AIDS pandemic. And so my entry point into Ethiopia, Kenya, et cetera, was really around a global health crisis. So it really wasn't around the activism related to, you know, the interracial or the social dynamics, but in the same way, we were able to see how the internal conflicts were decimating Black people. We know that HIV and AIDS really had a heavy impact on the continent and Black people in general. And so we were doing programmings with, you know, health organizations, NGOs, going into just different places, doing education, fundraising, and then also having cross-continental interaction. So we would bring individuals from the US into Kenya and back and forth However, wherever you're at on the continent or in the US or throughout the diaspora, we're so interconnected that you don't have to go too far to find someone from somewhere. So the work that I was doing in East Africa was really related to HIV and AIDS.
And do you think spending time there helped strengthen your sense of Pan-Africanism, or is that something that you were deeply believed in prior to you visiting?
Well, you know, in the U.S., Pan-Africanism and throughout the diaspora is it's very profound, and it's taken very seriously, particularly by those who are not on the continent per se. What generally takes place is there's an idealization about what Africa is and what Africa isn't. And so with Pan-Africanism, particularly from a U.S. standpoint, you will find that Black Americans and those in the diaspora know a lot more about the continent than sometimes those who are on the continent. And that is because, you know, we're intensely studying, we're idealistic about it. It's the utopian and all of those different things. However, when I began to travel to the continent, I began to see the impacts of colonization and populations that had absolutely no understanding of who they are prior to colonization. And so it's very eye-opening when you begin to travel and there's an exchange where individuals are learning more about each other at the same time, but there are those who take for granted their ability to just talk to their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, their great-grandfathers, embrace their own language, their own culture. You know, many would be so enthralled with the European trappings that they throw their own culture away, which is not only essential, but valuable. And now you see across the globe with Pan-Africanism, a lot of individuals are seeking to reclaim that which they took for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. And your use of the word is essential is, I think, really important, because cross-cultural exchange is something that's really done through traveling, and, you know, seeing sometimes is believing and having a deeper understanding of oneself and one's history. And we have seen a rise in a lot of Black diaspora going back to Africa just to better understand their roots, some for visiting and some deciding to permanently uproot their lives and make the move out there. So that's been, it's been pretty incredible to see, because there is one kind of perception portrayed of Africa. And I think for a lot of people, when they travel, that's kind of changed for them, and they understand the deep history and culture they come from.
You know, and not only that, you have a lot of individuals in the diaspora that have a closer connection to, say, for example, Africa. You have a lot of individuals that are what they would call Ethiopian or maybe East African, but they would have never been there. They have never traveled there. Their parents may be there. And in some cases, their great grandparents may be there. They have a great affinity for those particular countries. However, they have no context in terms of where and how that culture operates and moves. And so in addition to African Americans, you also have African Americans throughout the country that have that moniker in very different ways. So those who are from, say, for example, Ethiopia, and they were born in America, they're African Americans. However, what I see most powerful in the world today is what's taking place in Tigray, because those very individuals that considered themselves wholly Ethiopian, they are saying, who are we? They're saying Tagaru. And so when you think about the impact of what that means and how that came about, it became very interesting to me in terms of identity, how someone today could identify as Ethiopian and then tomorrow be firmly invested in who are we, Tagaru. And many of those individuals are African Americans. They're Canadian, you know, wherever they are in the diaspora, they are fully invested in the Tagaru identity, but the majority of them have never been to Tigray.
And just honing in a little bit at that, I know that you did spend some time specifically in Tigray, and you talked about how you've seen a shift in the war of kind of how Tigrayans, particularly in the diaspora, have identified themselves. I think originally, even though Ethiopia is made up of around 80 ethnic groups, you know, people kind of had a sense of nationalism against the Ethiopian identity. So what would you say, like, your perception change, particularly amongst Tigrayans, that you saw in Tigray, and then now, like, what you see with the diaspora and how they identify themselves?
Well, it's interesting because I talk to Tagaru throughout the world, and also on occasion, you know, inside of Ethiopia. And of course, because of the blockage, is not so much as it relates to inside of Tigray. And to a person, whether they're in the diaspora or whether they are there, they are identifying with their ethnic identity, so much so that many are looking forward to having their own country. And so how that works and the impact in terms of what I've been able to see is, for all of the years that I have studied Africa, and for all of the time that I have studied Ethiopia, I know that the majority of that time, if not all of that time prior to November 4th, was rooted in mythology, marketing, kind of a fantasy about this ideal place called Ethiopia. And when I began looking, when the war started, all of those myths began to just crumble before my eyes, so much so that there are individuals who are in Ethiopia or in the diaspora. They are also dispelling the myths that they were raised with. And it's a huge awakening and eye-opening time in world history when we look at what we're seeing take place right now within Tigray and this war.
I'm curious to hear what your initial thoughts were when war was officially declared on Tigray on November 4th, 2020. Obviously, in the US, very much as the world had their eyes on the presidential elections, a really significant campaign. So this mostly got overshadowed in world news. But for those in Ethiopia and those in the diaspora, this was something that we were kind of nervous about and we're very fearful of, particularly with a telecommunications blackout. So can you just describe your initial thoughts?
Well, my initial thoughts by the time the war broke out, I would say officially November 4th. From a historical standpoint and someone who studies conflict, I know that the common narrative that the general public receives is never the reality as it relates to war. And let me give you an example of that. Shortly after November 4th, you started having all of these explanations about why this has taken place. However, historically, we know that, as you mentioned, Jerusalem, the world was looking in another direction. So there was a smokescreen that was taking place, in the same way that Isaias Afwerki and others have done things in the wake of 9/11. Whenever there is a moment to strike, that planning has already been put in place for, you know, years and years and years in advance. So we began hearing about my cadre, and we began hearing about the storming of the Northern Command. And all of this is also in the context of COVID. We began thinking and hearing the reason was because the Tagaru held an election. Now, in a democracy, we're going to war because someone held an election, which is in line with the Constitution. All of these incongruencies started to take place. And so my response was, there's a deeper story to this. And I began to find, you know, what that deeper story was over time.
As you said, the conflicts rarely happen overnight. It's a buildup of a bunch of events that have been happening, whether through months, years, potentially even decades. And so what were some of the warning signs that essentially a war or conflict was going to be brewing that you particularly saw?
Well, if you think of what's taking place in Tigray right now, it didn't begin on November 4th. There had been long instances of blockades, lack of access, defunding. You started having these dynamics to where name calling was taking place. You started hearing about the dehumanizing elements of name calling and scapegoating and all of those elements that are also a part of genocide. All of that began to take place long before November the 4th. And so when we get to November 4th, the pieces that were put in place in terms of perhaps the national identity about those who are less than being attacked, they were already primed to look the other way. As a matter of fact, many believe that a favor is being done by attacking the Tigray as opposed to having a humanitarian or even a national outrage about what's happening to their own citizenry.
Yeah, and I think it was even felt like anti-Tigrayan sentiment was starting to even penetrate the diaspora communities. A lot of Ethiopian groups would kind of blame Tigrayans for the country's woes and things like that. And for some communities, there was already starting to feel some sort of isolation or some separation. And that was like just consistently brewed post Abiy being elected. At what point did you realize that this wasn't going to be a law and order operation, as Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed would often classify it, and it was going to be something more sinister?
Well, I always knew it was never a law and order operation. And the reason why is because initially, when we began covering this at the very onset of this conflict. We're 530 days into this. Prior to about 100 days, if you look at the national narrative, it was everything we were saying was not true. In other words, there were no rapes that were taking place. There were no Eritrean troops inside of Tigray or Ethiopia in general. My aha moment was, first of all, why would a sovereign nation be inside of another sovereign nation for any reason, participating in the attack of citizens? And if you recall, initially, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was saying that's not true. And then after 100 days, it began, well, they are inside of Tigray. They are inside of Ethiopia. And then they started shaping a narrative as to why. Well, the TPLF, they bombed Eritrea. So they started fixing these particular stories. And then the reports started coming out. I mean, the Amnesty International reports, the report about the massacre at Aksum, the report of, I don't know if they even knew I was human. These were reports that were coming out. But prior to that, from the very beginning, you had Doctors Without Borders. You had, the humanitarian relief organizations that were signaling what was taking place. And they were seeing the large, widespread displacement, and they were calling for aid and assistance. And that aid and assistance never came. And so it was very early on, I knew that this was more sinister than a law and order operation in the midst of COVID.
Yeah, and I think going on to your point, what was often used is because of the telecommunications blackout, the majority of the first 100 days heavily relied on communication coming from refugees in Sudan. And the Ethiopian government was very quick to dehumanize the refugees so as to invalidate their experiences, and using a variety of methods to kind of justify, like you mentioned, with Eritrean involvement was understood pretty early on, but it was explained away by saying that it was because rockets were launched in the area, so they're just protecting their borders, even though testimonies of tens of thousands of Tigrayan refugees in Sudan said otherwise. And then even with Filsan Ahmed, she stated that when she did hear reports of rape, particularly it seemed more like weaponized rape against Tigrayan communities, that the Ethiopian government said that they were only interested in acts perpetrated by Tigrayan forces, showing that they care more about the perpetrators rather than the survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And then because of this dehumanization that kind of happened, were you at all surprised by the silence of fellow Ethiopians, or even the approval about what's happening on? I know early on we saw people standing in minutes of solidarity for the Ethiopian National Defense Force. And I think originally it didn't seem as like severe. There were a few people being stopped from, like, prevented from traveling abroad and things like that. But then it got more into, if you're playing Tigrinya music, your businesses were going to be shut down. They had vigilante groups kind of playing neighborhood watch and people being put in concentration camps. And then this just kind of became normalized. Were you surprised by the silence of fellow Ethiopians, considering that Ethiopia kind of prides itself on a nationalistic identity and having that solidarity?
You know, I was more than surprised. And it's what awakened 530 days ago my demystifying my understanding about what is an Ethiopian. And I'm talking about from a country standpoint. I could never wrap my mind around the fact that here are individuals that are being raped and even systemically raped. And then you would see parts of the society even cheering and clapping as if there was a celebration. I'm seeing bodies thrown off of cliffs and shot openly. And I'm seeing citizenry like dancing as if it was an affair, like if it was an outing. And it reminded me of the climate in the United States of America, where they would have these public lynchings, but they would be celebratory moments where individuals would come with their families and their friends and their picnic baskets, and they would trade greeting cards and body parts of individuals who were either lynched or burned. And all I could say was, this harkens to that, which made me ask the question, okay, what is an Ethiopian? What does the country mean? What is the fabric of that? Because in the diaspora, individuals just think Ethiopia, the land of the Most High God and never been colonized. You know, it's this whole kind of banter and folks buy into it. But then when you think, why are Ethiopians doing this to Ethiopians? Then you have to ask, what is an Ethiopian? And so the whole behavior was not only absurd, but heinous. And it's nothing for the world to look forward to in terms of a utopian state, as has been prior to 530 days ago. So those are questions. Why some? If a foreign government was Eritrea being attacked by, let's say, those from Tigray, those are still Ethiopians. Even though we know that that's not the case, when do you have this national unification of support that hasn't come for 530 days? I've later come to find that historically, there has not been a unified Ethiopia. Historically, there has been genocide. Historically, there has been starvation. Historically, there has been disdain from one against the other. Historically, this has taken place. And so what you're seeing is a pattern in 2022. You're not seeing anything new. And if you start looking under and beneath the story, This is not the first time that Tigray have been burned and bombed. This is not the first time they have been starved. This is not the first time that the centralized government has turned its back on various portions of the population. As a matter of fact, in 2022, this is more normal than it is not. And if you don't believe me, talk to anybody in the diaspora from Ethiopia and ask them why they're in the diaspora. And many of them will tell you it's for the very same reasons that we're seeing taking place right now, that you had refugees dispersed throughout the diaspora in search of safety. And so Ethiopia's greatest export is not coffee, even though they export a lot of coffee and roses. Ethiopia's greatest export and largest export is its people. And that's tragic, because wherever those people land, they begin to be at the bottom of whatever society. They become the cheap labor, and then they have to rise up from the ashes. And that is because of the political climate, the social disunity, and the disregard of human life. And if Ethiopia is to ever be great, and if there's ever to be a unifying force, they're going to have to reconcile that particular history and those patterns that continue to go on every 30 or so years.
With all that in mind, what do you think about Ethiopian nationals, Ethiopian diaspora, and Eritrean diaspora, and also members of the Ethiopian government using themes like African solidarity and anti-imperialism to kind of, I guess, push aside any reasonable critiques and criticisms of the treatment of Tigrayans in the country? And this is not even specific to Tigrayans in the region of Tigray, elsewhere in Ethiopia as well, where we've seen Tigrayans being placed in concentration camps, being burned alive, and being slaughtered with no justice or accountability really happening.
Well, just use history as a lens to answer some of that question. Ruthless leaders and dictators always use populism as a rallying call to justify what they intend to do, where in reality, they don't care about the masses in general. So when you think about national solidarity in the midst of a genocide, there's no room for national solidarity in the midst of genocide when the nation itself is committing the genocide. There might be a rallying call, say, for example, in the United States of America, when 9/11 took place and those buildings came down, there was a sense of a united front across differences in pursuit of justice. Within Tigray right now and within Ethiopia, you mentioned there are 80 to 84, 82 different ethnic groups, and there are 9 to 10 different states. All of those are very different and distinct entities within the state. And everywhere you look, you will see that there's some discontent that is taking place, tragedies that are taking place, from genocide to the assassination of political leaders. In terms of the Oromo, you hear every one of the different groups saying what is taking place with them. So the way the government responds is by saying, we all have to be one. We all have to unite. We all have to have a sense of solidarity. But the question is, again, what is Ethiopian solidarity? Because there's no Ethiopian solidarity. And if you dig a little deeper, when you say we've got to fight against imperialism, Ethiopia is an empire. It is imperialism. And so if you think about the Pan-Africanist response, then you have to understand and ask the question, if you're fighting against colonialism and you set up the African Union inside of Finfini, If you set up the African Union inside of Finfini, which has been colonized, then you have these anti-colonialists setting up inside of an African colony. And a lot of folks don't want to discuss that. They don't want to say, well, what's going on with Finfini? Why is there an empire that has colonized an entire people and it continues unabated today? And there's this common narrative as if it's all one. So if there's a call for nationalism and there's a call for anti-imperialism, then Ethiopia is not the place that can make those calls.
Thank you. Something that you're very comfortable with saying, as well as Tigrayans in the diaspora and Tigrayans throughout Ethiopia, is that what's happening in Tigray and against Tigrayans is a genocide. This is not something that the international community largely has comfortability with. And even things like war crimes, crimes against humanity have taken quite some hesitation for anyone to claim, with the exception of maybe a few human rights organizations here and there. Why do you think there's so much hesitation, as opposed to other conflicts where words like genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity have been thrown around relatively quickly?
Well, to be more specific in terms of other examples, let's just talk about Ukraine. Everything that you see in the media that relates to why the world is coming to the support and the defense of, and rightly so, Ukraine, has taken place in Tigray. Everything. The bombing of hospitals, schools, citizens, churches, mosques, a wanton disregard for life. All of this is taking place in Ukraine, according to the very sources that are saying they had to figure out if it's taking place in Tigray. So much so that the technology where they were showing they can track the movement of blood in the war areas and troops without being there. You mean that technology didn't exist for Tigray? You mean all of those hearings and all of those testimonies and all those, well, tell us what you've seen. They couldn't see any of that with modern technology. There's no one on the ground that could speak up for that young girl that is being systemically raped in that family. There's no one that can say, well, you know what? There is starvation that is taking place. There's no real time, not only documentation, but response. So what you're seeing today is that the world can respond if it has the will to respond. And it's very clear. The United States seems to every few weeks be approving another $800 million. We want to give them the weapons that they need. They'll say everything except we are at war with Russia, which we are at war with Russia by providing the aid, the training, the support, the will, all of those different things. Well, what about Tigray? What about what's taking place there? They won't even say the word genocide, because the word genocide triggers in the international political sphere a response that must take place. So they'll tiptoe around it. Well, it's tragedy. It's horrendous. It needs to stop. It needs to cease. But on the political stage, genocide means something very specific. And that's why they don't want to say it. But let's be clear. Everyone knows a genocide is taking place. And genocide doesn't have to be just based on numbers. You don't have to reach a various threshold before it's a genocide. The policy simply has to be Jerusalem. If you are Tagaru, if you're a part of a community or a people, then this policy is designed to erase you, regardless of anything you've done or you didn't do. The policy is to wipe you out. And it isn't just the people, it's the cultural trappings. It's a whole lot attached to genocide that is taking place right now. We know it and we say it, and we're waiting for the world to not only know it because they do know it, say it and respond to it.
Even though genocide or war crimes and crimes against humanity aren't terms that the international is community is comfortable with using. We have heard phrases like ethnic cleansing and that Tigray is effectively under a blockade. And we've also heard that it's under siege. Considering this and the population at risk, over 7 million, why do you think the international community has remained largely inactive? And I'm saying, even though some actions have been done here and there, considering the response that it deserves and requires, I'm putting it in relation to that. So why do you think it is? So,
well, anytime I look at international politics and I listen to what world leaders are saying, I listen close. And they usually use a word that's in line with our strategic interests are at stake. So it tells me that the world's strategic interests are not in jeopardy as it relates to the Horn of Africa, particularly what's taking place in Tigray. It shows me that the world is probably, or the Western world is probably in line with having a railway or a highway or a roadway from Finfini, or what they call Addis Ababa, you know, up to the ports that have to go through Tigray. It tells me that there's international discussions about resources and things that, you know, are not in jeopardy. And as long as you have the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb open for trade to make its way across the Red Sea, coming from the Mediterranean, as long as those ports are in play, then our strategic interests are not jeopardized. And so it tells me that they have control of, they are not worried about, and they are willing to go to where their strategic interests are in jeopardy. And that's those pipelines in the Ukraine. That's what they call the European breadbasket. They're talking about the economy. So at the end of the day, it comes down to the economy. And if you look at Ethiopia's economy, it was growing over the past 30 years in terms of, and I'm talking about when Meles Zenawi, et cetera, were running the government. I'm not saying it was perfect, but I am saying there was growth that was unheard of, that now you're seeing a new leadership that is under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. The economy has tanked. The value of the currency is probably near junk bond status. The precious resources that could build the country are being deployed to purchase drones and weaponry and to go into debt because of war. And this is a total disregard for the masses of the people at the expense of keeping a few individuals in charge. But Jerusalem, I would say there's been a grave misstep that has taken place. There's a myth that Ethiopia has never been colonized, but they never want to talk to you about, one, if Eritrea was ever a part of Ethiopia. And if it was, then you're going to have to tell me, well, it hasn't been really colonized or fully colonized. And then they will talk about, we'll go into Mussolini. The reason Mussolini is out of Ethiopia is because of the British and the French, and because Mussolini joined in with Hitler. Now, the parallel that I'm making is, as the world is going to war against Russia, there was one African nation that voted against the actions against Russia, and there was one that abstained, didn't show up to vote. That was Eritrea and Ethiopia. Next, the United Nations just held a vote in the Security Council, and guess who voted alongside with Russia? That is Eritrea. And so what you're seeing is Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is linking up with Isaias Afwerki, and they're joining up with Russia and China, and they better hope that Russia prevails, because if they don't, then it's going to be the very same thing that we saw following World War II. You're going to see the dismantling, and you're going to see the protectorate, and you're going to see all of those on the losing side. Their countries are going to be dismantled, and they're going to be absorbed into the winning side. So keep your eye on what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and watch how Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is linked to Isaias Afwerki and Russia and China.
I'm curious to see what your opinions are regarding what will bring an end to what's happening, to the end to the Tigray genocide, to the conflict. What do you think it will take?
Well, it's going to take the continued effort of humanitarians beyond politics to continue to raise our voices. And I would just like to say to those throughout the world who are sharing, discussing, learning more, informing, calling political leaders, using your political stout and your political clout and influence, all of that is very important. There's been a sustained movement, like the Black Lives Matter movement, like what they call the Black Freedom Movement. There's been a movement for 530 days that has not ceased. You've had individuals that have been at the UN, they've been at the United Nations, they've been in every city, and you've seen that it's been taking place around the world. People who do not know who and what a Togaro is, they now know. What is it going to take to bring this to an end? It's going to take accountability. It's going to take Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed being held accountable for war crimes. It's going to take the world court and the world opinion saying that systemic rape, starvation, targeting, civilians, etc., is not acceptable. And it is going to take a removal politically of anyone who believes that genocide is an acceptable way to behave in the 21st century. And so, just in conclusion of that idea, or that notion, is it's going to take people who know that there's a better way to govern and live to not give up, not stop, not say there's nothing we can do. It's going to take everybody doing whatever it is they can do within their ability to do that. And it might be different for everyone. Brother Jeff might use a media platform like Jerusalem. There might be those who have political inroads. There might be those who have economic inroads. And if it's a political thing, it's going to take individuals in the diaspora to pull their resources and then place those resources in targeted efforts that get the attention of not only politicians, but the political sphere. It's going to take the Togaro community to stop allowing the nationalism, particularly from Amharic leadership and nationalism, to continue gobbling up the identity of Ethiopians as if they represent all of Ethiopia, and then they represent that in the political sphere. It's going to take the Togaro to show up and mobilize all of that energy and do voter registration drives, show their political strength, show that who they are and what the differences are. It's going to take a movement from who are we, Togaro, to what are we going to do, continue to do what we're doing, and we're going to stop this genocide, stop the Togaro genocide. That's what it's going to take.
And I want to close it off with this final question. This is going towards the everyday person, with keeping in mind the telecommunications blackout and the siege that's happening in Tigray. What can the average person do to help Tigrayans in Tigray, or help amplify the message of the diaspora in the US, Canada, and elsewhere?
I would say don't get caught up in the historical fight. Don't get caught up in this is about the TPLF or the TPLF. and get dragged into a political conversation. I would recommend that you use your humanitarian voice and say, I don't care what the reason is. Rape is never a good thing. Systemic rape is never a good thing. People are starving to death in the 21st century. There's a blackout. There's lack of a democratic process. And we know that that is because they're in line with China and Russia, et cetera. But don't get into the political dialogue with those who are going to tell you, you know what? Yes, there's systemic rape, but the moment you hear but, just stop and say, it's unacceptable. What can we do collectively across ethnicity, race, zip code, tribal identification, language, whatever it is? How do we use that collectively and say, we're going to stand up for those who are being targeted that have nothing to do with what's taking place other than the fact that they're Tagaru? Educate yourself, ask questions, follow up, and don't be afraid to engage in very difficult conversations, and then also be willing to learn how to have a conversation as it relates to genocide.
I agree. I think with what's happening in Tigray, you're fighting an uphill battle because the majority of people don't even know what Tigray, let alone Amhara or Oromia is. Like, if they're not familiar with this context, they kind of just know about Ethiopia as a whole. So educating yourself is definitely key. Understanding the historical background, finding resources, reaching out is definitely instrumental. And I thank you again, Brother Jeff, for joining us. And for all those watching, please continue to follow and subscribe Oxymind Media Network for more English content that will be published on a regular basis. Thank you again.
Tigray Tisser.
Tigray Tisser.